by the way, and you've heard me say this before, I'm very cautious when I talk about the roles of wives and the roles of mothers. Even though I'm going to talk to you about Scripture relates to it tonight, I try to be careful not to give too much specific kinds of application. And the reason for that is I don't know anything about it, other than what I can educate myself concerning what Scriptures say. In other words, I've never been and never will be in the role of a wife, and I never have been and never will be in the role of a mother. And so because of that, it is hard for me to find the appropriate ways to be able to give you the kinds of pictures that we might be able to do in terms of application in relationship to other kinds of subject matters. And with that said, may I encourage any and all that if you're desiring to know more and desire to appreciate more about these roles as we'll talk about them tonight, then I would suggest that you go find a good Christian mother and sit down and talk with her for a while. Or go find a good Christian wife and go and sit down and talk with them for a while. And you'll appreciate probably even more than what I'm going to be able to share with you this evening. But the husbands got the thunder beat out of them on the way home last Sunday night. And so in fairness, let's talk a little bit as best we can about the subject of wives and their role and the importance and contextually within our series, the importance of their role within keeping peace within the family. And so Titus chapter 2, and let's notice a couple of verses of Scripture. I just want to note verses 3 and 4 of this narrative. He says, "The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things." Notice that, by the way, real quick, that and he's about to bridge that for a moment here, but notice that he gives this obligation, particularly to older women in this context, that they live a proper example before others. That's kind of what he's driving at when he talks about them being reverent in their behavior, that they're not slanderers, that they're not given to much wine, so that they can be what? So they can be teachers of good things. It's going to be hard to be a teacher of good things if you and or I are not examples of good things. If I'm a slanderer, if I'm given to wine, if I'm given to the dispositions and challenges that will hinder my example, it's going to be hard to be the kind of teacher that God desires for me to be. And the education they are to offer, verse 4, is that they admonish the young women to love their husbands and to love their children. We sometimes speak about what we might call a motherly instinct, right? And I believe that to be somewhat true. I believe in some senses there might be a motherly instinct, a womanly instinct that might be part of the very creative power that God used and instilled within women. But I want you to recognize, though, that he understood, the writer, the authoritative writer understood, that younger women would need to be taught how to love their husbands. They would need to be taught certain things as to how to love their children. And you know, you can probably, and now I obviously don't want you to search too far in your minds here, but just think very generically for a moment, you have probably witnessed a few wives in your day that probably could have stood some education, who probably could have stood and benefited by somebody sitting down with them and saying, here's what God would expect of you in this relationship. Here's how you could have a more peaceable relationship with your husband. Here are the things that you could do that would strengthen your relationship with your husband. Again, in this stage of our study, and I apologize for the breaking point that didn't really fit last week, but we're talking about marital peace first. If mom and dad, if husband and wife aren't at peace with one another first, then the family will struggle to find peace. And that was a point that we illustrated with last week within our study. And so older women teach the younger how to love their husbands. Younger women, be receptive to that. Be willing to embrace the fact that I might not know everything instinctively. Embrace the fact that I might not understand every facet of how I can best be the wife I should be by instinct alone. That there may be some things that others could share with me. There may be some knowledge that others could impart to me, and it will benefit me in building a peaceful relationship with my husband. Because the truth of the matter is, no one is going to be peaceable, no one is going to be happy within the family framework if there is constant struggle and strife between husbands and wives. And so learn it. Appreciate what the Bible teaches and appreciate the counsel and instruction that can come from wives who understand, maybe through their years of experience, great lessons that could be imparted. Run over to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 and in verse 1. The Apostle Peter says, "Wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives." Side point for a moment, and I know this is a challenging subject. I find it fascinating, or at least interesting, that the Apostle Peter is discussing for a moment here wives whose husbands are unbelievers. That seems to be the implication when he says, "Wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word," they're not connected to Jesus yet, they haven't been obedient to the will of God yet, but that is not a permission slip to disengage from the spiritual obligations that God gives wives and husbands. Simply because my spouse may not be a child of God doesn't give me a permission slip to overrule him and not be submissive to him. Now, we understand the general principle, that is, we ought to obey God rather than men. That rules over everything. That rules over all relationships and all circumstances. And at any point in time where God's rule is superseding what my husband or my wife or my boss or anybody else for that matter tells me to do, God has to win. God has to reign supreme. But here he tells wives, be submissive, and even those of you who may not have husbands who have engaged their relationship with Jesus yet, still honor the role and the relationship that God has created within that marriage. And maybe, with great hope, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. When the wives conduct themselves in the godly fashion that God would choose for them, when they behave themselves in a manner in which God would deem honorable, when they observe your chaste, verse 2, conduct accompanied by fear, great benefit can come. And then verse 3. Do not let your adornment be, and I like, in some translations do it in varying ways, but the New King James puts the word merely in italics, meaning that's not a word that was in the original language, but it helps define what we're talking about in a better way in terms of the original words. And so he says, do not let your adornment be merely outward. In other words, there's no condemnation for wanting to look nice. That's what I'm trying to make sure you understand. There's not a condemnation here where he says you're never allowed to adorn yourself in a way that is presentable in some fashion. He said it's a matter of priority. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair and wearing of gold or putting on of fine apparel, but rather let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. I apologize, husbands, I'm coming back to you for a minute. In particular, those who are not married yet. And I want to ask you a very sobering question. What are you looking for? What are you looking for? You choose, as a wife, a woman whose primary focus is the outward adornment, you will get what you got. If she has no consideration whatsoever for her heart, if she has no consideration for her spiritual conduct, if she has no consideration for what is godly and what's right, you'll get what you got. A pretty mess. A pretty mess. Be careful. If God challenges women to focus primarily, again, He said not merely on. He didn't condemn it wholesale. What he said was, those who primarily understand that it is the hidden person of the heart that needs to be cultivated and grows. That incorruptible beauty of gentle and quiet spirit. This shell, it's corruptible. It ages. But the inward person becomes more beautiful as time goes on, when more energy and time is spent. And so wives, be that. Let your heart, let your spirit, let your inward beauty be your focus. And I pray for everyone, every wife, everywhere, and those who will be wives someday, that you find a man that will appreciate that aspect about who you are. And I would simply say to you, don't settle for anything less than that. Someone who will honor and appreciate the fact that you are striving to be what God wants you to be. And that long before you ever got married, long before you ever said, I do, you worked to cultivate an inward person. You worked to cultivate a heart and an inward conviction about who you are as God's child. And through your chaste and your quiet conduct, you'll be able to exemplify the kind of godly character that we see defined within Scripture. Do not let your adornment be solely outward, but focus on that inward person. And if you're so consumed with the outward, then don't be shocked when peace begins to dissolve within the family, because no effort was made to build the heart and inward soul of each individual. Marital peace. It's absolutely important. It's absolutely vital. And there's lots of things that we could say about wives and husbands, and I talked a little bit more about that last week. But let me just suffice to encourage every wife to build your character and your relationship with your husband from the inside out. And you'll build a strong bond between the two of you that will allow for peace, that will then transcend into our next phase of discussion, and that is the idea of parental peace. If husband and wife are getting their relationship in order, then the parental relationship will build as well. And so let's talk about fathers for a few moments. In Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 4. In Ephesians chapter 6 and in verse 4. He says, And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. You know, that's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Now, you wouldn't necessarily think that fathers would need to be warned about not provoking their children to wrath. You would maybe just kind of assume that what father in his right mind would want to create a scenario like that. But the truth is, the instruction is important. The Apostle Paul recognized that fathers have to be very cautious that we don't act in ways that actually produce the absolute opposite of what we're desiring from our children. Provoking them to wrath is not a good idea, and certainly is going to destroy the peaceful relationship. My obligation is not to provoke them in that fashion, but the text says it is to train and to admonish. Generally speaking, that doesn't work too well when I'm angry. I haven't done a very good job training and admonishing when I'm mad. I've done a good bit of provoking. I'll be honest about that. I've probably done a good bit of provoking when I was angry. But I haven't done a lot of good training and admonition. I need at times to stop and think. Is this a provoking moment or is this a training moment? Is this a moment where I'm just going to entrench my children deeper into whatever behavior that I'm trying to correct? Or is this a moment where I'm actually going to be able to train and admonish and encourage them to change their behaviors? Am I going to make them more obstinate, or am I going to give them alternatives and choices that will allow for them to make better and wiser decisions the next time? What's my choice and path? What's my purpose behind my actions? And fathers, we have that obligation given to us. And I think we make a big mistake sometimes when we relegate this off to the mothers and say, that's your job. You train them. You admonish them. Well, if the Apostle Paul had given me that right, I might encourage you to do that tonight. But he didn't do that. He said to us as fathers, this is our role. to make sure that we're training and admonishing our children in the Lord, and that they appreciate the benefits that come by a proper relationship with God, and to try to build them up without destroying them. You know, that's a fragile thing. Sam was working on what, I don't even remember what that was. He had some kind of thing, he was model-like thing that he was putting together a few weeks ago, and it was frustrating him because all it took was one slight mistake and 16 pieces fell off. And so then he'd have to start over and slowly and carefully work and finally, after a long period of time, he was able to get all those pieces to fit correctly without them falling apart. As fathers, that's a great analogy for us. Sometimes we have to remember that we've got to try to build and train our children without destroying them in the process. That's not always easy. Somehow I've got to find a way to help build and construct in some ways who they are as people and who they are as children of God without destroying them in the same breath. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 21. We'll get to verse 20, by the way, before the night's over. But for now, let's look at verse 21, where he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged." I pause because I'm not always very good at that. I'm not always very good at engaging my children even in disciplinary moments where I'm not provoking, where I'm constructing and building. Fathers, it's not easy. Being a dad is not an easy job. It comes with all sorts of accountability. It comes with all sorts of pressures. It comes with all sorts of life-changing kinds of things. And so I need to be very aware of how it is I go about leading my family and leading my children and educating my children so that I am not continually provoking to where they become discouraged. And I'm going to say this because I think it needs to be said. I think that needs to be understood in a spiritual context as well. There is a fine line sometimes between trying to encourage our children to stay faithful to God and provoking my children to where they become discouraged in their relationship with God. That's not always easy. And there are times where we need to pray for wisdom and guidance as to how is it that I'm going to be able to do what I'm supposed to do and be sure that that has as positive an outcome as possible. So with that said, let me jump half a second ahead and then I'll jump backwards. But children, give your dads a break. It's not as easy as you think. And we who take it seriously recognize that your lives depend on how well we do this job. Your futures are hanging in the balance. For those of us who take this seriously, your futures are hanging in the balance as to how it is that we handle this responsibility. So please, I'm begging you as children, recognize that. Please. Dads, quit provoking. Quit discouraging. Train and admonish. Do what we can to lead and encourage. Make for peaceful relationships with our children. I pray for a relationship that is long-lasting. So I want to be careful as to how I build. Let's turn our attentions to mothers for a moment. Run back to Titus chapter 2. We kind of blurred the lines a little bit in our discussion in relationship to wives, but let's go back to this text for a moment. In Titus chapter 2 and in verse 4. For But the writer Paul says that they admonished the young women to love their husbands and to love their children. Mothers, I know that maybe it seems redundant to you to say, well, love your children. But let me say that I've seen a lot of children who are obviously to me not loved. Ask any teacher who's ever been in a classroom in a school, and they could tell you right now which kids are not loved. Oh, they may be fed and clothed and cared for in physical ways at times, sometimes not, but they may have certain things. But I promise you, they can't legally give you that list, but they could anecdotally give you a list. It's obvious which children aren't receiving the kind of attention and love from a mother and from a father for that matter as well. It's obvious which ones have struggled to appreciate the kind of love. Mothers, learn it. Be sure that your children experience it. That I love you isn't just something you write in a card once a year to one another on a birthday or on a Mother's Day. But it's something that mothers and children are experiencing and growing in and appreciating about one another. To go over into 1 Timothy for a moment. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 14. He said, "Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, and give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully." I want to just look at that phrase in the middle of that verse for a moment. When he says, manage the house. Marry, have children, manage the house. In Titus chapter 2, we see that phrase, be keepers at home. And I think that sometimes we get this idea that be keepers at home means you need to stay at home. I don't know that that's what the language said. The language said be a keeper at home, meaning you're managing, you're maintaining, you're keeping that household. Mothers have a tremendous obligation and responsibility, and children, give them a break as well, in recognizing the sobering nature of the work they're doing within that home. They're attempting to manage and juggle, in my house, the 4 children that live there. Do the math. Right? She's trying to manage everything, all the schedules, including hers. And yes, she's allowed her own time as well, by the way. And I think sometimes there is a battle that can happen later when mothers have engaged in nothing but their children to such an extent that I've seen some begin to resent it because they have dedicated so much of their lives and sacrificed everything, and some begin to... So finding a balance in all that is hard. Being a manager at home is a hard task to fulfill, and yet it's the role that God gave mothers. Manage that place. Keep that home. And fathers and husbands, get out of her way and let her manage. And be cautious, husbands and fathers, to not micromanage the manager. Sometimes we are guilty of that. God said she's the keeper at home. God said she's the manager at home. Yes, I'm the authoritative voice. Yes, I've been given my admonitions. I've been given my instructions and role as a father and a husband within that household. And yes, there's a role of submission and all that kind of thing. We've already studied all that. But God told her, manage that house. And if I'm constantly in the way, if I'm constantly micromanaging her efforts to manage the home, then it's not going to make for a very peaceful relationship. I think the Scriptures would indicate to us that she needs to be given the tools and the latitude and the space, if you will, necessary to be a manager and to maintain the home as God would have it to be. And peace in the home is going to be very directly related to how well fathers and mothers handle those responsibilities. Peace in the home, peace within the family is going to have be tremendously impacted on how it is that you and I accept our roles as fathers and mothers, and as we work together to raise our children. And for children, there's admonition as well. Ephesians chapter 6. Children, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It's the right thing to do. And it will make a household a lot more peaceable when children avoid a rebellious spirit, when they avoid rejecting the instructions and guidance of their parents. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. You know, sometimes when we talk about children, we maybe assume that we're talking about children who are residing within the same household with their parents still. But may I remind all of us that honor your father and mother never stops. It never stops. If you are blessed to have your mother still with you, honor her. If you are blessed to still have your father still with you, honor him. That's what the Scriptures teach. Honor them. Respect them. Yes, we studied last week, leave and cleave. We studied last week about the importance of allowing for autonomous family relationships and recognizing that parents have to be careful not to meddle in their adult children's lives and be overly engaged. But the Scriptures are absolutely clear. In fact, Jesus dealt with some folks who said, it is Corban. It is a gift. And He said, in Brian's translation, nonsense. Your tradition is nonsense, Jesus said. To think that somehow you can skate away from your obligation to your parents is nonsense. Honor them. Honor your father. Honor your mother. And I say this to not drudge up too much pain and sorrow for those of us who have lost one or both of our parents. But someday you may look back and wish you had been more honorable to them. Someday you may look back and wish you had honored and cherished your parents more. And it may be too late. So do it now, children. If I'm young and still living in my father and mother's home, then recognize that's their home that they've created for you. They've been given God-given responsibilities to maintain peace and manage that home and to guide and train it, admonish you. And your obligation is to honor them, obey them, follow their instructions. And you may just be longing for that day. Oh, how glorious it will be when I get out from underneath their eye. Be careful what you wish for. Be careful. If you noticed in the notes that I gave you, I said particularly in relationship to those who are still at home. Be a child. Recognize who you are in that scheme. Be the child. In Luke chapter 2, and verse 51. Luke chapter 2, verse 51. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was subject to them, but his mother kept all these things in her heart. If you recall, this was just after Jesus had kind of stuck around in Jerusalem. I lose one of my kids in Walmart for 30 seconds and I'm a mess. Jesus was still back in Jerusalem. 12 years old and still back in Jerusalem. And you could almost sense the frantic nature of once the word finally spreads that no, he's not hanging out with some relatives or some other friends he has. He's not with us. He's not in the entourage that's traveling back home. Frantically go back. And yes, there is something very special about Jesus. Do you not know that I am about my Father's business? But even the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, even Jesus who was about His Father's business, even Jesus, the text says, went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. If my Savior can spend time honoring His parents and respecting their rule when He was the Son of God, when He was God made manifest in the flesh, and He knew He was that. What I appreciate about Jesus is the various things that Jesus did when He had power to do something else. I don't know that anyone would have questioned Him if He had just turned to His parents and said, listen, my time is now, I'm about my Father's business, and you all have to live with it because I got things to do. But Jesus understood what He was going to challenge all children to do eventually, and that is to honor their father and their mother, and that message that is to come, and He gives us the perfect example of that. And let me suggest to you that that honoring and that cherishing of His mother in particular is evidenced as well when you hear Him from the cross look down and say, Mother, behold thy son, son, behold thy mother, as He talks to John. Honor your parents, children. Honor them. Obey them if you're still living at home. Spend a lifetime of cherishing them. And there'll be peace within your family. There'll be peace in that relationship. And may I suggest to you, you might just find that life is a whole lot better for you. So I don't know about you, but when I had to be corrected and disciplined and challenged, those weren't very peaceable times. But when I respected and didn't rebel, did what I was instructed to do and gave honor and love, those were a lot better times. And as you grow older, I want to say it one more time, as we all grow older, that relationship never stops. And if you haven't talked to your mother and she's still living, if you're on the East Coast, you got 4 hours and a half. And shame on you if you don't. I don't know how else to say that. I don't know how else to say it. But I don't want to end on that negative. Thank you for those children who are honoring your parents. Thank you for those of you who do appreciate what your parents do for you. And you go wrap your arms around them, not just today, but you do that as much as you can. And if you have to leave the area someday, it's a shame. But it's the truth. We don't have the ability to keep young people around our area as much as we used to. But we live in one of the easiest technological ages that we have ever experienced in this world. We can shrink our world in half a second. So you honor them. You honor them. And when I say you, I should be saying we, me. And we'll have generational peace if we'll do that. And what I simply want to emphasize with that thought as we conclude tonight is simply this: that peaceful homes lead to future peaceful homes. By the way, I could show you that statistically. I could show you the pattern of challenged homes. We often, in our vernacular, call them dysfunctional homes. And I could show you statistically how they propagate another dysfunctional home, and they propagate another dysfunctional home, and they propagate another. And sometimes those trends are broken. But generally speaking, you reap what you sow, right? And I need to be sowing a peaceful home environment. I need to be sowing to a peaceful family relationship, not just for my direct and personal benefit in the moment, but I want the same for my children. When they grow up and if they begin to have their own families, that I hope that they'll take what they learned in my house, if I'm working and striving to create a peaceful, loving place for them to be, that they'll extend that, and that someday, long after I'm gone, if this world still stands, there'll be somebody talking about their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And more importantly, their great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, who created a peaceful home for 3 children, who went on to have other children, who went on to have other children, who went on to have other children, who loved the Lord and built good homes for them. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, it seems like an odd place to be for a moment, but we'll learn our lesson here in a second. He said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." By their fruits ye shall know them. We should strive to have peaceful family relationships that are evidently so. I want the fruit of my family relationship to be one that others can appreciate and benefit from. I want to see a legacy as I've been blessed to have. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I stand in this pulpit and I look back and I don't see you all. And I don't see whatever color these are they mauve, whatever that is, I don't know. I see brown back pews with a cushioned white tannish seat with them 3 ripples in them. And I see faces. Lots of faces. Who, because of their labor and their honoring of their God and their efforts to build peaceful families, we not only have peaceful physical families, but we have a peaceful spiritual family that resides here and worships here together. It's a wonderful thing if I can create a peaceful environment for my direct family in the moment. But I long to just simply continue a heritage that was long before Brian ever came around. And to extend that until the Lord returns. In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 19. One more odd passage, but I want you to see a point. He said, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. Wisdom is identified by its offspring. Wisdom is identified by the things it produces. It may have seemed unwise for him to be spending his time with sinners and winebibbers and gluttons and all those tax collectors and all that kind of thing. But the ultimate benefit is seen by its results and the things that Jesus was accomplishing with the lost. The illustration I simply want you and I to recognize is that should be the purpose and goal for us. That wisdom drives us to build peaceful family relationships so that we can experience it today and that it can be known and understood by family generation after generation after generation. Because though our spiritual family has a primary in certain levels, but I have heard, by the way, erroneously taught by some that almost you are allowed to connect yourself to your spiritual family and practically disconnect yourself from your physical family, as if this one was so primary that you don't have any obligations to the physical one. And I say the Bible doesn't teach that. The Bible says a man who won't take care of his own is worse than an infidel. That sure sounds to me like the physical family. Yes, there's a special relationship that we have spiritually, but it doesn't disconnect. And let me also say to you that I think the two can really go hand in hand. And the more peaceful family relationships we have from the physical side will benefit the spiritual side as well. If our physical families are struggling, then the church will struggle as well because of the results of that. And so let's do what we can. As imperfect, as absolutely imperfect as we are, as flawed as we are, let's do what we can to build the kind of family relationships that will benefit and strengthen all of us. From wives and husbands to mothers and fathers to children, let's fulfill God's purposes. Let's build peaceful family relationships. And let's grow from it all. If we could encourage you tonight to become part of God's family, there's no more peaceable place to be than within the household of God. Because God is our Father. Jesus is our brother. And if you've yet to honor them by being obedient to their will, if you've yet to render obedience to the gospel, or maybe something we could pray for you concerning tonight, we'd invite you to take this opportunity to soberly consider your relationship with God. And if we could help you in some way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?